Hello again. I'd like to think together with you now, if I could, about the way in which some of these ideas of Derrida intersect and come into conversation with ideas from the Bible. And I'd like to begin with the notion of ontotheology again, and try and compare it with the idea of absolute personality theism that we're familiar with already from last week. So, ontotheology, if you remember, is the idea of a God who is a concept, an idea, the highest being, and a God who fills in the gaps that philosophers can't fill in their systems with anything else, a sort of polyfiller or putty God. Now, the logos of ontotheology is very different to the logos of John chapter 1, the prologue of John's Gospel in the Bible. Because what we see in the logos of John's Gospel is, on the one hand, absolutely very much someone who is on the creator side of the creator-creature distinction. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And yet also someone who becomes a person, Jesus Christ, an individual. And this brings together the absolute, the universal, and the particular, the individual person. Now, this has lots and lots of consequences. I just want to tease out one consequence of this, particularly for the relationship to ontotheology. And we can get at it really clearly in this quotation from Cornelius Van Til from his Defense of the Faith, where he says, "There were no principles of truth, goodness, or beauty that were next to or above God, to which he patterned the world, according to which he patterned the world. The principles of truth, goodness, and beauty are to be thought of as identical with God's being. They are the attributes of God." In other words, being itself and truth and beauty are not more fundamental than God as a triune person. He can't be split down into parts, constituent elements that are more fundamental than he is. The bedrock of our universe, that simpler than which and before which there is nothing, no parts, is the triune personality of God himself. Personality and Trinity are the bedrock of our universe. They're not made up of anything more simple than they are. And therefore the God who is the highest instance of being is precisely the opposite way around to the way the Bible thinks of it, which is that God himself, in his triune personality, is primary. And concepts like being and truth and goodness have valency within the world that God has created and can be truly used to describe God, but they don't precede him. He is not simply one instance of them. Now, one of the consequences of this is that the God of the Bible diagonalizes ontotheology and Derrida's immediate absolute demand of the other. So for Derrida, on the one hand, you've got the impersonal God idea of ontotheology, God as a concept. And on the other hand, you've got the Yahweh's injunction to Abraham, absolute, personal, immediate, incalculable. And there's no way of reconciling the two. But what we see in the absolute personality of the Bible is that on one hand, God is universal. One can speak of God, and God speaks of himself in language that is transferable from one person to another, that more than one person can understand. So God is universal in that sense. And on the other hand, God is also personal, individual, absolute, immediate to us. So there's no dichotomy between the sort of injunction that Abraham receives in Genesis 22 and the public truth, if you like, that ontotheology has. Within the biblical frame, those two dichotomous options are diagonalized. They're not an either or anymore. And finally, in this section, I think it's really important to mention that absolute personality theism also challenges the arrogance of claiming to know the absolute. If you remember, Derrida's problem with both theism and atheism alike is that they claim absolute knowledge. They've climbed up the greasy epistemological pole, so to speak, and they've reached the top, and then they can arrogantly proclaim, I know the absolute. Now, I think the main problem for Derrida isn't therefore in and of itself a claim to know the absolute, either by theism or atheism. It's the arrogance, it's the overreach of that claim. Now, of course, he'd have problems with knowing the absolute per se, but I want to focus on the idea of the inappropriate arrogance, which, of course, I think someone looking at this biblically would wholeheartedly agree with. How absurd to claim to know God by our own lights. But, of course, that isn't what the Bible's claiming. Not that we climbed the greasy pole to get up to God in our knowledge, but that Christ slid down the pole, came to us, and revealed God to us in words that we can understand. Now, Calvin puts his finger on this very astutely in his Institutes, where he talks about this concept called accommodation. Let me read you this quotation. The anthropomorphites also, who dreamed of a corporeal God, because mouth, ears, eyes, hands, and feet are often ascribed to him in Scripture, are easily refuted. For who is so devoid of intellect as not to understand that God, in speaking to us in language that we can understand, lisps with us as nurses are wont to do with little children? Such modes of expression, therefore, do not so much express what kind of a being God is, as accommodate the knowledge of him to our feebleness. In so doing, he must, of course, stoop far below his proper height. Now, one really important thing that's being claimed here is that the problem of God speaking in a language that we can understand about himself, revealing himself truly, that's God's problem. It's not our problem. We don't need to rise up and become epistemological giants in order to gain knowledge of the absolute, because God has taken it upon himself to condescend. It's his problem to express himself in language that we can understand, and therefore the arrogance is on the other foot, isn't it? Now the arrogance is to claim that God couldn't possibly do that. God could never communicate truth about himself in a way that I can understand. That would be the arrogant claim, not investigating the idea that God has revealed himself in language that I can understand. Assuming that he is incapable of doing any such thing. That's the arrogance now. Not the claim to know the absolute, but the dismissal of the possibility of knowing the absolute.